friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we will talk about the land revenue settlements. In the earlier lecture on land revenue settlements, we talked about the objectives of the British with regard to the land revenue settlements and how they introduced these kinds of settlements in India, whether the permanent settlement or Yetwari or Mahalwari, all these three land revenue settlements which were introduced by the British, and how the objectives was to maximize the land revenue in that sense. And there was a lot of debate when the permanent settlement was introduced in India, and how they borrowed from the French physiocratic ideas during that particular period, and how scholars like Ranjit Guha, they have argued that how the issue of property, the private property was introduced in the land by the British, because that was the thing which was not found earlier. So, this aspect of private property was introduced by the British through the various laws which they in a way enacted in India with regard to the property, and these land revenue settlements, all of them, their chief objective was to increase the land revenue for the benefit of the British. And how we see that even the British officials like John Shore, as I told you, that they talked about that how things which are being grown on a particular piece of land, and if the crop is worth 100, then the 45 was going to the government and only 40 was left, 40% was left to the cultivator and 15% was going to the zamindar. So, in that sense we find that the peasants, they were at the receiving end of the government. And as we talked in the earlier lecture as well, that how British they wanted to maximize their revenue, and we find that these kinds of oppressive taxes, they could be collected by the oppressive methods only, and how zamindars, they weren't given these kinds of right to oppress the peasants so that they are able to meet the demands of higher land revenue. And the regulations which were made in 1793, 1799 and 1812, zamindars now could seize or carry away the tenant's property if rent had not been paid, and he did not need permission of any court of law to do this. This was a legal method of harassment. And we also find that the zamindars often resorted to illegal methods such as locking up or beating the tenants who had not paid whatever was demanded. And the immediate effect of settlement was to greatly worsen the position of the actual cultivators of the soil and to benefit the zamindars and the British government. So, we find that how the permanent settlement was greatly in the favor of zamindars, and we should not forget that they were also now obliged to pay a fixed amount by fixed dates every year, and any failure on their part meant the sale of zamindari. So, the sunset laws, in that sense they were being imposed, and the zamindars, they had to pay the land revenue by the sunset of that particular date, and if they failed to do so, then their zamindaris, they were being sold by the British to the new zamindars. And we find that how these zamindaris, they were rated for the large sums, that left no margin for the shortfalls due to flood, drought or any other kind of calamity, because British, they were not in a way empathetic to the peasants or the zamindars for such kind of vagaries of nature. And we find that as a result, many zamindars and their zamindaris, they were being taken away, and they were sold in decades immediately after the permanent settlement. And when one is talking about the estimates, one finds that in Bengal itself 68% of zamindari land was sold between 1794 and 1819, and the merchants, the government officials and other zamindars bought these lands, and the new buyers would then set about trying to increase the rents paid by the tenants to make a profit from their purchases. And the people, those who in a way studied that how the kind of things they were unfolding, Raja Ram Mohan Roy for that matter, remarked that under the permanent settlement since 1793, the landholders have adopted every measure to raise the rents by means of power put into their hands, and many zamindars still found it difficult to pay amount demanded by the British. So, the people, those who were the contemporaries, those who were in a way viewing what actually was happening, and Raja Ram Mohan Roy was also in a way connected with the British administration as well. And we find that how the kind of measures which were adopted by the landholders and the kind of power which they exercised. So, it became very difficult for the peasants in that sense, and how zamindars, even they had to pay a higher amount of land revenue to the British. And we find that the Raja of Bardhaman then divided most of his estate into lots or fractions. They were called Patni taluks, and each such unit was permanently rented to a holder called a Patnidar, who promised to pay a fixed rent. And if this Patnidar, he did not pay that particular rent, then his Patni could be taken away and sold. So, we find that during this particular period, how British, they were trying to extract much more from the cultivators and the zamindars as well, and the zamindars, they were being forced in that sense to collect more from the peasants, because the kind of demand which was being made from them was very high. And when we find that such kind of a system, because of this, many of the zamindars, they resorted to some kind of process of sub-infeudation, and how they rented out the land to some a person, and how he in a way rented out to some other person. So, over a period of time, gradually we find that the population of Bengal increased, and the waste and the jungle land, they came also under cultivations, and because of which the rent also increased during this time. And we find that the kind of money which was being paid to the government in terms of taxes was fixed. So, during over a period of time, the position of zamindars, it also improved, and they were able to lead some kind of a life of indolence and luxury at the expense of their tenants. And we find that only in 1859 the state took steps to protect the rights of the tenants, and some kind of law was passed which bestowed a limited protection on the old tenants, who were now termed the occupancy tenants. So, despite any kind of laws which were being made in terms of providing a kind of relief to the tenants, we find that how these laws they operated, the way they were being in a way imposed, or they were being operated by the government, we find that they were not able to secure any kind of help from the government. Apart from the permanent settlement which was introduced in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, we find that British, they also engaged in a way introducing other land revenue settlement, and Rayatwari settlement was a type of revenue settlement where we find that cultivator individually acquired ownership rights in land. And some of the colonial administrators like Thomas Munro and Alexander Reed, they opposed the existence of intermediaries between the cultivators and the state, and they suggested that a direct settlement of land revenue with the cultivator or rayat, Arabic word rayat, often used for peasants in the pre-British sources, actually meant the subjects. So, we find that the Rayatwari settlement, which came where settlement was directly made with the peasant, and the government did not want any kind of an intermediary, as it was happening in the case of the permanent settlement. And it was also being felt that the position of the Rayat would definitely improve, and they would also in a way invest some kind of a money to improve the land as well. And we also see that how land revenue settlements, which were being in a way introduced at that point of time, how they were also influenced by the kind of ideological positions which were there in Britain at that point of time. And utilitarian doctrine, which was the dominant ideology which was prevailing in the company's administrative circles at this point of time, was based on the principle of appropriating maximum amount of net produce in form of revenue. So, utilitarians, they in a way wanted that how the appropriation of the maximum amount of net produce should be done, and utilitarians, they talked about the greatest good of the greatest number. But when utilitarians, they were operating in India, we find that their aim was to increase or to maximize the land revenue, and the net produce could be calculated if peasants' cost of production was known, and the land revenue administrators could then simply subtract or minus or subtract this cost of production from the gross produce to arrive at the figure of the net produce. So, we find that such kind of measures in the framework of the Raiyat-Wari settlement, they were being introduced at that point of time, but we also have to see when the state was dealing with each and every cultivator then it meant that there was a need for an elaborate machinery of revenue administration down to the village level, and the colonial state stood to gain financially, as there would be no intermediary group appropriating a part of agricultural surplus, and it could periodically revise the land revenue demand after 20 to 30 years. And they felt that it would be in terms of beneficial to the British, and how they could also revise the land revenue demands after a particular gap, so that their revenues would further increase. And we see that during this time, or for that matter even during the pre-British period, that was the Mughal period, and how the village level state officials, they existed during this time, and in the administration in the western and southern India, in Maratha polity, village level Kulkarni, he kept the accounts and the records, while Patils, they enjoyed the legal and the policing powers, and these officials, they were paid by state for their services as well. And we also see that how the colonial state thought of eliminating or reducing their power, but realized it could disturb the structure of village community. So, the colonial state, in that sense, we find that was able to extract as much as influence as possible for themselves, and how it wanted to in a way increase the resources available with them. And we find that even in the Raiyat-Wari areas, these officials were either retained or allowed to evolve into proprietor cultivators, and the main source of their sustenance were inam lands, and inam lands were the grants of land for a specific purpose and were tax-free assignments. And we find that an implicit policy to retain the pre-existing landed magnates was followed to win their support as well. So, in Raiyat-Wari areas, we find that how the proprietor cultivators, many times they were being given the inam lands, and these inam lands, they were the tax-free assignments, as I told you, and they were being given for some kind of a purpose. And this kind of a policy which was being maintained or which was being undertaken during this time, why this was being retained, was in a way to win the support of these people. And we find that when one is talking about Raiyat-Wari settlement as well, then its impact in that sense was also harmful to the rural economy, and how the position of the peasants became impoverished, and they lacked resources to cultivate the new lands as well. And we find that how the government of Madras noted in 1855 that only 14 million acres of Raiyat-Wari land were cultivated, by 18 million acres were wasted. And it confessed that there is no room for doubt that an increase of cultivation would follow reductions of the government tax. So, the governments, they also realized, but we also see that some of the areas, they were even left vacant, or cultivation was not being done, and land was getting wasted as well. And this kind of these kinds of things, they had some kind of a depressing kind of an impact on the rural economy as well. And we find that the heavy burden of taxation, it distorted the land market during that time, and we see that the land in most districts of Madras had no value in the first half of the 19th century, because people would not buy it, because it meant that the new owner would have to pay very huge land revenue, and after paying it, he would not have any income from the land, and obviously in such circumstances nobody would be preferring to purchase such kind of land. And we find that it was replaced by a reformed system in Bombay devised by two officers named Wingate and Goldsmith, and their system did not try to apply any theoretical rules. Instead, it aimed at moderating demands to a level where it could be regularly paid. And we find that the actual assessment of each field depended upon its soil and the location, and this new assessment began to be made in 1836 and covered most of the Deccan by 1865. And the effect on agriculture were beneficial, and the cultivated area expanded as a new assessment was introduced. And we find that when this kind of a reformed Rayatwari system was introduced, that gradually developed in Bombay after 1836 and Madras after 1858, the burden of land revenue was somewhat reduced and land acquired a saleable value as well. And we also find that how the purchaser could now expect to make a profit from owning land. The state would now not take it at all as tax, and one result of this was that moneylenders began to seize lands of their peasant debtors and either evict them or reduce them to the tenants, and this process led to the considerable social tension at that point of time and caused a major rural uprising in Bombay Deccan in 1875. So we find that how a lot of experimentation was also being done by the British in different regions in terms of the kind of assessment which was made by them. And we also find that how they were also borrowing some kind of ideas from the philosophical trends which were there in Britain. As I told you, in permanent settlement, the French physiocracy ideas, they were being in a way implied, and the kind of changes when the revenue settlements, they were being visualized, and in actual practice the way they were being implemented, there were also changes in that as well. So all of that must have contributed in that sense, and we find that apart from the Rayatwari and permanent settlement, as we have talked about and discussed their impact as well, another important settlement was the Mahalwari settlement in western part of northwestern province. Parts of central India and Punjab revenue settlements were made either village wise or estate wise, mahal with landowners or heads of families who collectively claim to be the landlords of villages or estates. And we find that in these regions the joint landlords of village lands were collectively responsible for the revenue appropriation, and in many of these cases revenue was paid collectively by the peasant kinship units, and the land resource management in these areas was not hierarchical in nature, and kinship groups controlled the land revenues or the land resources. And we find that the East India Company Halt Mackenzie's Minute in 1819 became the basis of land settlement with village landlord communities. So how land was to be in a way collected, land revenue was to be collected in a state wise or village wise, and mahal with the landowners or the heads of families who collectively claim to be the landlords of the village or that particular state was to be done. And we also see that the detailed records of the rights, they were prepared after systematic survey and inquiry in the various districts, and the land revenue collection was to be done with the help of influential landowners in the Mahalwari settlement as well. So in this way we find that the various land revenue settlements which were introduced by the British, they all of them, they wanted to have wanted to maximize the profit of the colonial rulers. And in the Mahalwari settlement we find that these people, they were designated as lambardars or persons, in that sense those who were the influential landlords. And these people, they had a number in collectors register which contained the list of persons responsible for paying the land revenue to the state. And the proprietors of a mahal were individually and collectively responsible for the payment of land revenue assessed by the state on that particular mahal. And we find that in Mahalwari system also the land revenue assessments were periodically revised as well. And we find that when one is talking about the effects of the Mahalwari settlement, the areas under the control of the big talukdars, they reduced during this particular settlement, and the British officers, they made the direct settlement with the village zamindars as far as possible. And we also see that even supported them in the law courts as well, because when talukdars brought suits against them. So, in that sense we find that the various kinds of laws which were framed by the British during this time, they were in support of the elites, or the people, those who were moneyed or those who had money, and how these people, they were aligning with the British as zamindars, or as the influential people. And we also see that the so called village zamindars, they were supported only because it was planned to extract the highest possible revenue from them, and they were freed from talukdars claims only to subject them to a full measure of the government taxation. So, this settlement Mahalwari also brought about poverty and dispossession in the cultivating communities of northern India in 1830s and 40s, and we find that they also resented in that sense and expressed themselves in the popular uprisings in 1857. In that year, villagers and talukdars all over northern India drove off the government officials, destroyed the court and the official records and the papers, and ejected new auction purchases from villages. So, we find that 1857 proved that how the Indian peasantry, for that matter, was also dissatisfied or discontented with the British, and how they in a way destroyed the government records which they had, official records of the papers, and how the peasantry was also in a way wanted to destroy the records of the money lenders as well. And we find that how this kind of a discontentment was evident during the 1857 revolt, but it was brewing for so long in that sense. So, all the revenue settlements we have seen, their main aim or main intention was to increase the British land revenue, and they wanted to use that particular land revenue for their own purposes, not only in terms of purchasing products from India initially, and then we find that how they started to purchase the raw materials from India which were needed by the British industries which were undergoing the industrial revolution. So, all sorts of investments, they were being made from the land revenue which was collected by the British, and thereafter we also see that how British, they engaged in different wars in India. They were in conflict with the Marathas, Mysore, and apart from India, they also attacked other regions like they had wars with Afghanistan, Nepal, Burma, and other regions as well. And British, they wanted to in a way increase these regions. They wanted to bring them in their own domain so that their resources also increase as well. And we find that this kind of an idea to collect the large revenue was very central to the British policy in those times, and we find that sometimes this led to the development of a land market as well, that how land became a sellable commodity. The kind of notions which were there in earlier times, that how land was to be worshipped, it was considered to be mother. But this kind of an approach which was brought about by the British, we find that land became some sort of a commodity because of the British intervention. And when we find that what was the objective of the British in that sense, then how we realize that the demand of the state was always very heavy. And many times we find that purchasers of the land, they could not be found, and the need to collect so much was itself made necessary by the heavy expenditures of the government of India, as I told you earlier as well, and its need to send the large sums to Britain for its expenses there as well. And this we talked about in the lecture which we talked in the framework of the drain of wealth, that how money was being drained out of India, and land revenue settlements also in a way contributed to the British revenue as well, and how it the kind of money which was being generated through the land revenue was also exported to Britain as well. So with this, I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.